Star Wars has a long and fabled history. It started with humble roots as an ambitious sci fi film created by the man behind American Graffiti, which was released to critical acclaim, as well as the dystopian sci fi flick THX 1138, which was.
Before, have we been so contented? Never.
It eventually found its own cult following. Despite Lucas's previous commercial failure in the sci-fi genre, Star Wars: A New Hope found a level of success that nobody could have predicted at the time of its release. The world wanted more Star Wars, and Lucas was more than happy to give it to them. The original trilogy took the world by storm and casted a shadow over the sci-fi genre so large that it still remains nearly half a century later. However, even after the release of Return of the Jedi, the world was not finished with Star Wars. The world still wanted more, and more was what they got. Much, 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 much more. Novels, comic books, video games, cartoons. There wasn't a single medium that Star Wars didn't exist on. I mean, they even had an NPR radio drama of the original trilogy, for Christ's sakes. Which, fun fact, when NPR approached George Lucas to obtain the rights to produce the series, George charged them $1 for each film they adapted, which I think was a really cool thing for Lucas to do. It kind of reminds me of Stephen King's Dollar Babies program. If you're a film student and are interested in adapting one of Stephen King's short stories, you should check it out. It's pretty cool. Anyways, it was through all this that the Star Wars Expanded Universe was born. And while most of the Expanded Universe stories were standalone tales that weren't directly tied to the films, there were some books like Heir of the Empire which acted as a direct sequel to Return of the Jedi. Yeah, before Disney's sequel trilogy, this was considered the sequel trilogy. The Expanded Universe was not without its faults, though. For one, many of the writers behind it were really fascinated with giving elaborate backstories to characters who show up in the movies for like 2 seconds. Like, did you know that the stormtrooper who says,
"Look, sir, droid."
Yeah, that one. He got PTSD after witnessing the executions of Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru. Believe it or not, that's one of the more subtle examples. However, all of the Star Wars Expanded Universe, both the good and the bad, were wiped away from canon following the Disney acquisition and was subsequently rebranded as the Star Wars Legends continuity. For those of you who were around for it, you'll probably remember this being one of the most controversial aspects of the buyout. Many fans were crushed to find out that characters they'd grown to love over the years, like Mara Jade, Kyle Katarn, Ben Skywalker, and countless others, were all wiped away from existence with only a single decree from Disney. As time has gone on, though, many popular Legends characters have made their way into the Disney canon again. Thrawn returned in Rebels, Darth Bane's Legends backstory was for the most part restored, Dirge has shown up in the Dr. Aphra comics, Jason Solo found a pseudo-rebirth through Kylo Ren, and Rise of Skywalker even turned out to be a very loose adaptation of Dark Empire. Who would have thought? However, as of the making of this video, it's now approaching 10 years since the Disney acquisition, and many Legend stories still remain lost, and likely will stay that way for the foreseeable future, if not forever. So, I decided as a means to help preserve the memory of the Star Wars Expanded Universe, I'd start this series where we can take in-depth looks at some of the stories from Star Wars Legends, and if applicable, see how they compare to their canon counterparts. With that preamble out of the way, I'd like to start this series off by taking a look at a character with a Legends backstory that is very near and dear to my heart. So, let's take a look at the noble warrior turned living war crime. This is the legend of General Grievous. General Grievous is a character of very polarizing portrayals, and much of that is due in part to his initial appearance in the 2003 Clone Wars micro-series, where he was given a very grandiose introduction. I have vivid memories of seeing him as a child and being awestruck over how absolutely terrifying this guy was. You see, the thing was, all anyone knew from the promos leading into the episode was that something big was going to happen, and other than a few ominous clips of a shrouded figure stalking Jedi, that's all we were given. Then the day of the episode arrived, and we were met with this. Nobody had ever seen anyone wield a lightsaber the way Grievous did before. Keep in mind, even seeing Asajj dual-wielding lightsabers in that same series was considered a bit of a novelty at the time. To go from that to seeing a cyborg vulture monster try-wielding lightsabers while also spinning like a Beyblade was something my 10-year-old mind just wasn't ready for. However, this take on Grievous did not translate to his film counterpart. I don't have any sources confirming it, but I do believe the reason for this was due to Revenge of the Sith still being in the early stages of pre-production at the time. Genndy Tartakovsky, the creator of the micro-series, was pretty much given nothing but a piece of concept art and a bare-bones description of Grievous being a cyborg who hunts Jedi. So he just took that concept and ran with it. It wasn't until well after Grievous's debut that Lucas had a clearer vision on how exactly he wanted Grievous to be portrayed in the movie.
The ultimate scary guy, a kid.
He's a video
Spoken.
player.
Is somebody a parent?
Nonetheless, Tartakovsky's vision ended up being the defining version of Grievous that future legend stories would base their inspiration from. He was a monster. He cut down Jedi Masters in droves, he brutalized a young Boba Fett, he even kidnapped Jedi younglings and tried assimilating them into Force-sensitive Magna Guards. Even the 2008 Clone Wars series, which had much more creative oversight by George Lucas, would see a more menacing take on General Grievous compared to his film counterpart, albeit not quite to the degree he was portrayed in Legends. This also begs the question, what made Grievous like this? What made him into such a ruthless, bloodthirsty monster? One of the recurring themes of Star Wars is that no one is innately born evil, and that good people, or at the very least well-meaning ones, can lose sight of their goals and become the very monsters they swore to fight against. Legends Grievous is no different in that regard. General Grievous, born with the name Caimane
Hai Shilao.
Yeah, that. Caimane was harsh, but he was caring. He grew up on the planet of Kali, where his people were regularly terrorized by a neighboring race called the Yamri, who liked taking native Kalish as slaves. Wanting the best for his people, Caimane spent his entire youth fighting the Yamri, and during his conquest he met another warrior named Rondaroo. The two of them became very fast friends and never left each other's side on or off the battlefield, and eventually they fell deeply in love. That love was short-lived, however. During a battle, the two were separated and the Yamri ended up killing Rondaroo, and then dragged what remained of her body out into the ocean because they knew that the Kalish had very strong religious ties to burying their dead, and the Yamri wanted to make sure her people suffered over her death. Caimane was absolutely devastated by this. He was so heartbroken, in fact, that he came to realize that without Rondaroo, he was destined for a life of nothing but grief. So he decided to adopt a name befitting of someone with such a fate. Thus he became known as Grievous. Filled with rage and sorrow for the loss of his beloved, Grievous went on a warpath so savage and relentless that the technologically advanced Yamri invaders were forced into a full-blown retreat. Grievous, however, felt his enemies hadn't quite suffered enough yet. So he stole a bunch of their ships, loaded them up with an army of Kalish warriors, and invaded one of the nearby Yamri colony worlds. After the Yamri had finished collectively shitting themselves over the ordeal, they did the only thing they could and reached out to the Republic for help, claiming that the Kalish had attacked them without provocation. The Republic then took one look at the invasion and saw the technologically inferior Kalish using Yamri ships to invade a Yamri colony world, and said, "Yeah, that sounds about right. We'll send you a fuckload of credits and a couple of Jedi to sort it out."
We're keepers of the peace, not soldiers.
It was reasons like this that so many Outer Rim planets were so eager to join the Separatist movement. Grievous and his invasion force were repelled off the planet, and Kali was sanctioned into economic devastation as well as forced to pay massive reparations they couldn't ever possibly make. Not wanting to let his people starve, Grievous took work as an enforcer for the Intergalactic Banking Clan, who offered to pay off Kali's debts in exchange for Grievous' services. This arrangement came to a premature end, though, after Grievous caught wind that the Yamri couldn't go 2 minutes without being assholes and desecrated some ancient Kalish burial sites. Naturally, the Republic didn't feel this was a punishable offense. At this point, Grievous decided that Kali just wasn't going to be a part of the Republic anymore, so there was no need for him to pay off the planet's debts. So he returned home to plan for a second war against the Yamri. The IBC was less than thrilled by this turn of events, so they made sure that Grievous couldn't walk away from them again. With the assistance of Count Dooku, Grievous' shuttle was sabotaged and crashed into the ocean, killing all of Grievous' fellow warriors on board, and leaving Grievous himself barely clinging to life. When Grievous finally came to, a mangled and broken man barely held together by a bacta tank, he was met by none other than his former employer, San Hill of the Banking Clan, who claimed that Grievous' ship had been sabotaged by the Jedi, and the Banking Clan just so happened to pick up Grievous' distress beacon. This was bullshit, of course, but they wanted to make sure Grievous had a strong motivation to work with them, and they knew the Jedi were a very sore spot for Grievous. San Hill then extended an offer to Grievous. In exchange for having his body rebuilt and reconstructed into a cyborg that could lead the Separatist droid armies, the IBC would personally see to it that Kali's famine came to an end. By this point, Grievous had spent his entire life fighting for the people of Kali. He sacrificed literally everything he had. He lost the woman he loved, leaving behind a fracture in his mind and a broken spirit. And now his body was mauled and destroyed beyond the capabilities of ever being a warrior again. He literally had nothing left to give, other than the desire to see his people live a better life than the one they were born into. So, with no small amount of reluctance, Grievous accepted Hill's offer. What happened to Grievous after this could only be described as a tragedy. Despite clearly expressing that he didn't want his mind altered, the Geonosian engineers tampered with Grievous's brain anyways to ensure that he was in a near unending state of rage, and to enhance this rage even further, set the most traumatic memories to the forefront of his mind. This would mean that, in addition to the severe dysphoria he felt over his new cyborg body, he was also living in an unending PTSD episode. For General Grievous, every waking second was a nightmare. And as shown before, following the death of Rondaroo, the only way Grievous knew how to cope with pain was by inflicting it onto others. Grievous was always intended to be a foreshadowing of Darth Vader, and Legends really tried to capitalize on that take by making his backstory very reminiscent of Anakin Skywalker's. They were both born on a backwater planet dominated by slavery, they both became revered as heroes, they both fell deeply in love with someone only to end up losing them, and they were both manipulated by having their sentimental attachments and desire to do right used against them, ultimately turning them into ruthless monsters who'd lost all their humanity. The only real difference between them is that, unlike Vader, Grievous never got to have his moment of redemption, and instead died as the monster he'd become, which in a way makes his death even more tragic. Compare this to his canon iteration, and you'll see that much of his Legends backstory has been retained. He comes from the planet of Kali, he grew up fighting the Yamri, his hatred for the Jedi was sparked by the Republic's intervention in the Yamri's favor, and at some point he was in a space shuttle crash and got rebuilt as a cyborg. There's no mention of his lover Rondaru, or any reasoning why he was in the war with the Yamri in the first place, but generally speaking, the broad story remains the same. However, the method by which Disney reached that point has been very frustrating, for lack of a better word, and it's one of the reasons why I chose Grievous as the first subject for this series. General Grievous is an excellent example of how Disney's Star Wars likes to approach canonizing Legends material. From the very beginning, they stated their reasoning for decanonizing the EU was because Disney didn't want to be restrained by the established canon. They wanted to be free to make their own stories without fear of contradicting something already established. This is greatly contrasted against Lucas's approach, which was he did whatever he wanted and Legends would just adjust to match his vision, even if it meant retconning a few books. However, I can understand why Disney went with this approach, and in many ways I do agree that Legends had become massively bloated by 2012 and was in need of trimming anyways. I just wish they didn't go full scorched earth with it. That said, because of the approach Disney has taken, they very rarely like to make broad brushstrokes when it comes to reintroducing Legends material unless they plan on making a book or TV show out of it. They intentionally breadcrumb the details piece by piece as to not accidentally show too much of their hand and inadvertently get pigeonholed by their own content a few years down the road when they want to make a new story about the character in question. And when I say piece by piece, I mean piece by piece. Just compare the citations between Grievous's canon and Legend Wikipedia pages. Looking at the sections involving Grievous's space shuttle accident and the transformation that ensued afterwards, you'll see that the Legends page cites 5 different sources, which are composed of one source book, a comic, a Star Wars Insider article, the Labyrinth of Evil novel, and literally Revenge of the fucking Sith. Then look at his canon page covering those exact same events and you'll find not 1, not 2, not even 10, but 16 different sources, which are composed of 3 individual issues from 3 different magazines, 2 short stories, a comic, the DICE Star Wars Battlefront 2 video game, General Grievous's Star Wars databank page, a General Grievous helmet collection set. What the fuck? And 7 reference books. One of them literally named Star Wars Absolutely Everything You Need to Know, updated and expanded, which implies that the previous book, Absolutely Everything You Need to Know, was not, in fact, absolutely everything you needed to know.
Impossible. Perhaps the archives are incomplete.
Yet, despite having immensely more sources to draw from, anything pre-Clone Wars on Grievous's canon page still reads as anemic compared to his Legends one. The reason for this is because the vast majority of content we have on Grievous's origin and canon right now is purely superfluous tidbits of information that add nothing to the character. And that's the thing about the canon iteration of Grievous. He doesn't really have a backstory. He has a series of events that occurred around him that eventually led to him showing up in the Clone Wars. Outside of a few small glimpses, we don't get a lot of insight as to what exactly motivates him. In Legends, he was a noble, albeit ruthless warrior who wanted to free his people from alien invaders. Then, after those invaders killed the woman he was deeply in love with, he was driven into a horrible depression that sent him on a psychotic rampage against them, only to then be robbed of that revenge by Jedi intervention. That is the story of someone who I can understand saying lines like this.
Listen to me, Jedi. I do not care about your politics. I do not care about your republic. I only live to see you die.
Speaking of the 2008 Clone Wars series, something that a lot of people either forget or just don't realize is that nearly the entire original run of the Clone Wars had been produced before the Disney acquisition, meaning that this was intended to coexist with the Clone Wars series, and stripping that away really robs the character of any degree of nuance they once had. Now, don't get me wrong, I am self-aware. This is a fanboy complaint regarding a very niche subject when placed next to the Star Wars fandom as a whole. I mean, let's face it, even if 1.5 million people are tuning in to watch the finale of Book of Boba Fett, it still doesn't hold a candle to the roughly 10 million people who turned out to watch Rise of Skywalker on its opening weekend. So I can guarantee you that the amount of Star Wars fans that are even aware of Grievous's origin and legends is a pretty insignificant number in the grand scheme of things. So why am I so passionate about it then? If this is such a small concern for the fandom as a whole, then why get so riled up about it and make a 20-minute video on it? Well, it's simple, really. Grievous's origin and legends is a very Star Wars story. It's a story about love, adventure, tragedy, and the desire to rise up and fight against injustice. It has all the makings of a great story that could do well with a proper novelization. And it's frustrating that 10 years later, Disney continues to just dance around the subject by continuing to drop breadcrumbs of superfluous information that vaguely alludes to his legend's origin, in whatever source book happens to be coming out that month, instead of actually filling in the gap they created by decanonizing it in the first place. Would I be mad if Disney went out and completely reworked Grievous's origin? Maybe, but I'd still give it a fair shot. However, until that day comes when they decide to do that or simply canonize his legend's origin, the gap will remain, and it will continue to be noticed. Not by many, but by me at least. Nonetheless, Grievous's origin and legends was arguably one of the best pieces of supplemental content to come out from Star Wars' expanded universe. It gave a surprising amount of depth to a character who was otherwise incredibly one-note, and in the end, it makes them a better character because of it. That's what I look for in these sort of stories about established characters in Star Wars, especially origin stories. Sure, it might be cool to see them go on a small-scale adventure before they set out on the big one they're known for, but the true appeal to stories like those is how they enrich the characters they're centered around and how they help us appreciate these characters more when we see them in the movies and shows we know them from. Do I think Disney will eventually fill in the gap? Yeah, I do. Disney isn't stupid. They know that there are a few fans like me out there that are dying to see Grievous's origin from Legends, even if it is slightly reworked. However, I just don't think it's a high priority for them right now. With Disney focusing a lot of creative efforts on the High Republic, as well as TV shows set after Revenge of the Sith, I just don't expect Grievous's origin to be something that'll come around anytime soon. But I do think it will come around one day. However, until that day, all we can do is wait and complain about it online, like all Star Wars fans do. Well, I hope you liked the video. This is something new for me, but ideally, I'd like to try making a video like this at least once every 2 weeks. So, if you're interested in seeing those, then go ahead and like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, guys.